I'm Martin Belrose. I will moderate this conference tonight with you. So this, the intersection of ecology and Christianity. Our guest speaker is Heather Eaton. This presentation will explore the development of eco-theologies, its trends and limitations, and the key developments in the efforts to green Christianity. What does it mean to be a green church? What happens at the intersection of ecology and Christianity? It will also explore the issue of justice, especially that of gender justice, and where that intersects with other topics. So our guest speaker is Heather Eaton, is currently professor at St. Paul University in Ottawa and an expert in eco-theology. She is on the board of the journal Worldview's Global Religion, Environment and Culture, the steering committee of the Religion and Ecology session of the American Academy of Religion. She has authored and edited books like Ecological Awareness, Exploring Religion, Ethics and Aesthetics, Eco-Feminism and Globalizations, Exploring Religion, Culture and Context, and Introducing Eco-Feminist Theologies, and others. She was a past president of the Canadian Theological Society. So welcome to you, Heather. Thank you to accept to be our speaker tonight. And also I want to thank Renaud Grégoire to have organized this this event online tonight. So from the Green Church. So Heather, the mic is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Renaud. Thank you all who are here. It's really nice to see some friends I haven't seen in a while, like Monica and John and Roberto, and some friends I have seen recently. It's very nice to see you all. It's true, Martin, as he mentioned, you are free to keep your video off, but I would love it if you turned it on, because when you give presentations to just a black screen, it's not so much fun. So if you'd be willing to put your video on, that'd be great. So my presentation's got three parts to it. The first part is a bit about the history of eco-theology. The second part are the challenges in the development. And the third part are current questions. Depending on our energy level, I might pause after each section and we can chat a bit. You use the chat function. Martin will make a list of some of the questions and group them if you have them, and then we'll chat together. So I'm just going to begin by saying eco-theology has really been around since the 1970s as a discipline, and it's been quite active from the 1970s to the present. Christianity was very challenged to begin addressing ecological issues. Some of you may know the famous article by Lynn White that Christianity was responsible or at fault for the ecological crisis in the West. This is kind of a classic article. Some of the first responses to the ecological challenge to Christianity was people got quite defensive and said, no, Christianity is not at fault. It can't be at fault. There's too many other cultural currents. But then what it did was it really was a challenge that Christianity had ignored ecological issues. And in the 1970s, not everyone was paying attention to ecological issues, but Christianity became quite challenged. And one of the first steps that occurred was to retrieve ecological insight. So things like creation theology, that became a topic of interest. What is creation theology? And I don't mean here the doctrine of creation. I mean, what does Christianity have to say about creation? Another initiative that began that developed into what is now called the Earth Bible, which is a whole series of books about ecological insight and wisdom in the biblical tradition. People then started looking at some classical theologians like Thomas Aquinas or Hildegard of Bingen, Francis of Assisi, Meister Eckhart, and to the present, to Teilhard de Chardin. They started looking at different Christian thinkers and what they had to say about ecology. And sure enough, they found that there were some ecological thinkers, influential thinkers, or influential theologians who had a great deal of ecological sensitivity. But it couldn't be said that Christianity was an ecologically sensitive religion. That couldn't be said. So then, as we moved from the 1970s to the 1980s, people really began seriously looking at what is the intersection between Christianity and ecology. And of course, some serious problems emerged, which every religion that starts looking at ecological issues in the contemporary context is faced with some what we call discontinuities in their own tradition. So one of the issues with Christianity was that it was what we call otherworldly. So its emphasis was on the next world, whatever that is, or another world, or not this world. I remember seeing a bumper sticker at St. Paul University, and it had a picture of the Earth from space, that very iconic image of the Earth from space. But what was written was, Jesus, don't leave Earth without him. So this became the problem with Christianity. What does it mean, don't leave Earth without him? As if we're going to be leaving Earth and going where, and what is this other realm, and is salvation really off planet? Is that what this means? So it began some serious investigation into otherworldly spiritualities, otherworldly notions of salvation. And it really, if some of you have read Teresa of Avila, she said, human life is like a long stay in a bad hotel. So there was a strong emphasis across the Christian tradition over the centuries to say that this life is not particularly relevant. It's really about the next life. So this really had to be looked at, and it had to be looked at in terms of what is sin, what is salvation, what does it mean to be redeemed, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus if the emphasis is this world or another world. Christianity was also challenged and criticized for being what we call anthropocentric, meaning only interested in the human, that the human is the only image and likeness of God, that humans are the central drama of salvation, we would say, that all the rest is just a backdrop. So this also had to be looked at, and it was challenged. And then in the 1970s and 80s, the feminists got involved. Some of you, I'm sure, would know Rosemary Radford Ruther, challenged Christianity for the inferior status of women, which continues to this day, I might add. But what is the connection between women and nature? And why are women and nature inferior to men and culture? And this was a theme in Christianity, and it had to be redressed. It had to be challenged. But if you have been in the business of religion or Christianity as long as I have, you know that people are loath to change their religious beliefs, and they're loath to examine what they hold dear to their heart. So this was not easy. These were not easy processes. And when the feminists got involved in the 1970s and 1980s, it was the birth of ecofeminism, which is various connections between women and nature and feminism and ecology. The conversation then moved on to what does it mean to challenge the Christian worldview? Are matter and spirit in fact divided? So there are tenets in the Christian tradition that would say spirit and matter are divided. It has had a focus on transcendence rather than immanence, to use classical Christian language. That God is in fact more absent and elsewhere than present and embedded. So you start to see that there were lots of ideas that had permeated the Christian tradition that had to be re-examined. Creation, as mentioned, became a very important theme. And if you know Christian doctrine, the doctrine of creation is that God created ex nihilo, which is out of nothing. But in fact, that really wasn't that important. What was important is what about creation, this creation, the one we live this earth community with which we live, what we are embedded in. What does that mean? If God is a God of creation, then why is it so absent in both theological discourses, church discourses, rituals, liturgies, theology? What does it mean to say that God is embedded, that the natural world is embedded with divine presence? What does that mean? So in theological jargon, we talk about pantheism and panentheism. Is God just present? Is God just absent? Or is God just present and beyond? So these were theological themes that really began the development of eco-theology. It also became clear that whatever salvation is, whatever we mean by this word, and I've been doing this most of my life, and I think that there's not a serious reflection on what salvation actually means. People believe all kinds of things, but based on what? Substantiated by what? So the topic of salvation became an important theme. If salvation is a vibrant Christian theme, then it has to be bigger than just humans. So does that mean all of the earth has to be saved, all of the solar system, all of the cosmos? Or maybe salvation has to be understood as a process rather than an event, that the world is becoming, that it's not sinful needing to be redeemed, but it's in the process of becoming. So a theologian like John Hott would talk about that it's all about the promise of creation, and it is en route. And that whatever sin is, what does sin actually mean? So the whole understanding of original sin had to be re-looked at. It had to be understood that sin and salvation are not about humans in an afterlife. They have to be understood in a bigger context, and they have to be far more intelligible. So all of this theological work went on for decades, and some of it is still ongoing, of course. And then in the 1980s and the 1990s, the liberation theologians got on board. So someone like Leonardo Boff wrote the book, Cry of the Poor, Cry of the Earth, that the cry of the poor was connected to the cry of the earth, that these are connected realities. And of course, you can connect these in different ways, but that something about the marginalized communities of the world were also the ones suffering a great deal from ecological stress. So they had to be looked at together. So if I know many of you have spent time in Latin America and Central America, so you know about water issues and land grabs and all kinds of actual serious ecological issues that marginalized communities were very different. They didn't have the political power to mitigate changes. So this became a very central focus. Another focus became the development of ethics. So people who were working in Christianity and ethics had to start looking at ecological ethics. What does that mean, ecological ethics? Are they Christian ethics, or are they just social ethics expanded to include ecology? So this was another topic. And then the other final topic that I'm going to mention was that retreat centers began, and I know some of you ran these centers, so I'm speaking to those who know, began doing a lot of work on ecological spiritualities, that people needed a spirituality that was ecologically sensitive. People needed to understand that their experiences of the natural world were relevant to their religiosity, that this was important. So all of this work happened over several decades. And of course, it was not smooth. Christianity did not move itself into an ecological awareness with ease and grace. Some wanted to stay within the, I would call, traditional conventions. So that either Christianity was already ecological, or we just simply needed to be better stewards. We needed to do better environmental management. So that is a fairly comfortable intersection between Christianity and ecology, is that we just need to manage it all better. So we can stay within our comfortable Christian parameters, and we just need to manage the natural world in a better way, perhaps more just. We need to be more attentive to marginalized communities, maybe women. this is a kind of conventional connecting of ecology to Christianity. But then the prophetic traditions, which are always a part of Christian traditions, the prophetic traditions said there's two things going on. One is a prophet of doom and gloom, which said ecological disaster is coming. And I have been doing this since the 1980s, and we are now, well, it's quite some time, let's just say, and I'm not sure we've made any improvement. So the prophets of doom and gloom have something to say, and they need to be listened to. But then there are also the prophets of hope to say change is possible, resources are there, we can join with other social movements, we can join with other insights, with other religious communities, that hope is a possibility. So the prophetic tradition in many different ways became engaged. And just to say, the prophetic tradition in Christianity is always a minority, probably not in this Zoom gathering, but in general, a lot of Christians, in spite of the fact that they're Christians, they really don't particularly like putting themselves on the line and calling for change and confronting truth to power, as we say. It's not a comfortable place to be, and sometimes it's a very short-lived place to be. But the prophets in the Christian tradition were a very significant voice in bringing ecological issues to Christianity. Then issues of economic injustice became important. How does economic injustice connect to ecological injustice? And this is a really significant field of eco-theology, of analyzing that ecological issues don't take place in a vacuum. They take place because of economic policies. They take place because of agricultural policies or corporations, or they take place because of political apathy. They take place because ignoring the earth has been the history of, or the recent history of Western civilization. So it's not that Christianity is at fault, it's that we have lived out of an ecologically extractive economy and the earth has deteriorated as a result. So it's not just that Christianity had to confront this, the Western civilizations has to confront this, but certainly Christianity did as well, and especially because there was a criticism that Christianity was partially responsible. So to speak up and to speak out was the beginning of eco-theology, calling the churches to both self-examination and to be active participants in ecological and social change. So that's basically my small summary of 30 years of eco-theology. And we can pause here for comments or questions, or I can go on. So if you have comments and questions, put them in the chat and Martin will address them. Otherwise, I'll just keep rolling along. Or you can wave if you want to say something and I will see you, or should I just roll along? Kathleen. You know you're muted.
I'm interested in the intersection of government. There seems to be, most people seem to be pointing to governments to do things. Which is in a way, another comfortable way of doing it for Christians.
Oh, yeah, agreed. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, do you have any comment about the role of government in the connection and intersection?
I don't have anything that I could say about government and Christianity, but I do think that governments have been very slow to respond to ecological issues with any kind of strength. And we've seen that today in the G20. They walk away, the affluent countries of the world walk away and say, oh, we really didn't do anything particularly strong. And and I'm, what is the Christian lobby for governments? What does that mean? So, I think that's a worrisome language, because the United States is a country where there is a strong Christian lobby, but I'm not usually, well, personally, I don't find that a particularly useful lobby because it's a very narrow one. But where does a Christian I'm not talking about the stance of the believer. I'm saying this, the values, the social values that are embedded in Christianity and justice. Where do they get a voice in the society, and where do they pressure the governments to act on them? And I don't think that's an easy alliance, but I do also think governments have been quite weak in their responses to ecological issues. So that's not a very good answer. Sorry, Kathleen, but it's a very good comment.
Well, thank you. I guess that's sort of where I find a bit of a struggle with faith-based eco-theology is there's a tendency to blame governments for everything. You know,
Okay.
things aren't going well, so it's all the government's fault, which relieves people of their own personal
Right.
and collective responsibility.
Sure. I mean, you know, lots of corporations are not, you know, oil companies are constantly lobbying the government to relax environmental regulations. And I'm sure some of those people attend church. So then there's a question of where are churches calling people to corporate responsibility? Are churches calling people to have a sense of the common good, of solidarity? And I think the churches have not done a great job of that either, myself. There's a couple of more comments, Martin. I just see
Yes, there's some questions. The first one is the Catholic Church's inability to recognize the true insight and contribution of women a major stumbling block to fully embracing eco-theology. How can Christian women overcome this? And maybe the other question can be linked also. When did you see eco-theology linked with anti-colonialism and indigenous rights?
Okay. So first of all, not all women are feminists. I think that's very clear. And surprisingly, some men are feminists. So the idea of equality and autonomy of women, it's not just women's equality, but it's women's autonomy, has to be supported in the whole society. I am not at all at this stage in my life convinced that most women are feminists or even understand what it is and how radical the revolution is of a feminist agenda. I'm not sure if women participating in the Catholic Church, you know, do they want a piece of the pie or do they want a change of the recipe? You know, how far, you know, if you want to be a part of the patriarchal church, I'm not sure we've gained a great deal. So the Catholic Church, in my view, has remained quite mired in its patriarchy. So women participating in the patriarchal side of the Catholic Church, I'm not sure, or any church or any religious tradition, I'm not sure exactly what they bring. I do think the feminist movement brings us major social change. But again, even feminists are not all ecologically sensitive. So just because I used to have a button, I think you, Monica, we used to have the same button way back in Toronto that said, add women and stir, you know, we just had these buttons, you just add a woman and you get a feminist perspective. And that's not true. So a feminist perspective to me is a critique of society. It's not, you have to learn it. You have to understand it. It's not just a given. So that's not a great answer about women in the Catholic Church, but we'll get so depressed and I'll have to go get a great deal of wine if we're going to carry on that one. I do think that eco-theology in its trajectory, or theology in its trajectory over the past 30 years, has had to look at its colonizing tendencies, its imperial tendencies, the fact that it's overrided indigenous traditions or any other forms of religious insights or spirituality. You know, the Christianity had a very strong imperialist, evangelizing superiority, and that is a very destructive energy in a world full of multiplicities of spiritualities and spiritual wisdom and religious traditions. So Christianity has had to, in general, back away from its imperialist stances. Of course, not all traditions have done it, and not all of them have done it well. But I think there is a shift to more what we call critical race theories or post-colonial understandings, or a genuine respect for religious insights from other traditions. I think that is the direction Christianity, or what we call global Christianity, is going. It's not smooth and even, but it is going that way. I have two other sections. So can I just do one more section and then we'll take some more questions? Is that, can I?
Yeah, it's
start
exactly what
falling
I would
asleep.
like to suggest. So you can go with your second section.
Second section. So the second section is about challenges and developments. And some of this is a continuation of some of the things I've just been saying. Just to say, when I use the word Christianity, there isn't really such a thing. There's lots of different Christian traditions. There's lots of different sub-traditions. There's lots of different beliefs that are some rooted in tradition, some not particularly. So to say Christianity it's a difficult term to use, but what we can say in general and ecumenically is that there is a reform taking place in Christianity as a result of ecology, and there's a reconstruction taking place. Both of those things are taking place, a reformation and a reconstruction. Now, I work with colleagues around the world, and I work with colleagues who are quite conservative, although rarely, but I do. And I work with people from other religious traditions as well. And this whole process of reforming and reconstructing religions is taking place in Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Baha'i. It's taking place. There is a religious move in the direction of ecological sensibility. I'm part of the Forum of Religion and Ecology, so I see lots and lots of changes. But, are they smooth and easy and acceptable to everyone? Well, no, they're none of those things, but they're still taking place. So for a religion to shift its emphasis is a big project. It's a very big project. People have to shift worldviews, beliefs, but then they have to shift all the elements of a religion, and religions are broad and complex, and they have many different personal and social elements to them. So one of the issues that is still ongoing with Christianity is this otherworldly salvation, that we are going to be saved to another time and place. And I think it is highly problematic. I think the whole notion of resurrection to another place and time, it's problematic. Christians and Christian theologians can live in small insular worlds and not pay attention to other knowledge systems. If you were to study theology and you did biblical theology, you might never, ever get out of the first century. I mean, you just might not, because theologians are not necessarily trained in broad intellectual traditions. They're not encouraged to read widely, let's say, in science or sociology or psychology. So it's also very true that still today, theologians are, and I was trained as a theologian, they're not trained in ecological literacy. I mean, it's very interesting. So those of us in this part of the world, how many of us actually learn to grow food? How do we, where does our food come from? That whatever toxins you put down the sink, you're going to drink later. So this kind of basic ecological literacy is not known in Christian training, but it's also not known at a social level. So I don't think theologians are trained with broad intellectual traditions. I don't think church pastors are necessarily pastors or priests, or they're not trained in broad traditions. And I think that has kept Christianity at a fairly insular formation, and hasn't pushed Christianity to dialogue, to be open to dialogue. So these are still ongoing problems. And I think that another problem that exists is that people are very apologetic about Christianity, that it's got so many elements of truth that we really can't challenge it. The flip side of that is that if you challenge religious truths, you will find more truths. You will find something that goes deeper and broader and more rich. So the fear of examining our beliefs, to me, is quite misguided, because I do think that the truth sets us free, but it has to be substantiated and rich and profound. So I think there's still an insular nature to the Christian expressions in most parts of the world. Of course, not everywhere, and of course, not everyone. I think a question we have to ask ourselves is that affluent Christian cultures have been implicated in ecological decline. It's a fact. So is it Christianity? Is it the culture? Is it the apathy? Is it the government? Is it the corporations? What is it? But they are Christian influenced cultures, and they have been involved in ecological decline, and they have been somewhat apathetic to change. So those are real obstacles that I think are still ongoing. Many here, because I know at least half of you have worked in multi-religious settings. And so you know that all the world religions are facing this transformation in the face of ecological issues. But when we work and live in these larger contexts, we realize that if all religions have something to say about the divine, have something to say about the sacred, the holy, the mystery, whatever language you would like, this is a challenge to Christian supremacy. And this is a real challenge. Christianity, in fact, all religions have some form of supremacy, but Christianity is not situated usually it's not situated very peacefully in dialogue with other religions. And unless we take an attitude that Christianity has truths to contribute, but not all the truth. It's not the only way to be. It's not the only way to be a deeply religious, spiritual person. So this is also an ongoing conversation in eco-theology. Some of you, myself included, will have studied Thomas Berry. And Thomas Berry brings another dimension of challenge to the conversation, because he says that when we're going to talk about ecology, when we're going to talk about spirituality and ecology, we actually have to start not with the Bible, not with Jesus or the incarnation. We have to start with the origins of the universe. We have to start with the origins of Earth and Earth. So the universe is 12.6 billion, Earth is 4.6 billion. Evolutionary processes on Earth. We currently live in what's called the Cenozoic era of the past 65 million years. This is Thomas Berry's approach, that if you want to understand anything about being human in this Earth community, you have to understand that we evolved from within the processes of the Earth, that we belong to and we are embedded in the processes of the Earth. So he has this adage where he says, the Earth is primary and the human is derivative. He also says that all spirituality emerged from Earth processes, which means that religions are secondary revelations, which means the book of nature in the Celtic tradition is primary. Now, I know that doesn't sit well with a lot of Christians who would say sola scriptura or the book of scripture is primary. But there is another conversation partner, which is the Thomas Berry, who was Catholic priest, a Passionist priest. He would say, we really must understand our deep belonging to the natural world, including to the point to say that our spirituality has been shaped by the magnificence of the natural world. And this has repercussions as the natural world declines. What is going to happen to our spirituality as the natural world declines? And that is a very daunting prospect. Another challenge that is ongoing is that Christianity, like most classical religions, is steeped in patriarchy. And being steeped in patriarchy means that it has dualisms of heaven and earth and spirit and matter and divine and demonic and culture and nature and men and women. And for some theologians, feminist theologians, this is not fixable. So someone like Rosemary Radford Ruether wrote a book called Gaia and God. So Rosemary Radford Ruether is a Catholic theologian, but she said anytime she's dialoguing with the Vatican, it's an interreligious dialogue, because what feminists have to say is so different than what the Vatican has to say. So I'm just saying these are ongoing tensions. They're not resolved. They're moving along, but they're not resolved, and they carry on. I think what we miss often in eco-theology are the prophets, and I'm not saying the prophets come out of the Christian tradition, but who is calling us to change our hearts and our minds around ecological literacy, ecological spirituality, eco-theology? Who is calling us to this? And who helps us to consider those who benefit least from our dominating economic systems? Who calls us to realize those who suffer from ecological ruin and those causes often come from affluent cultures. So this discrepancy of affluence and poverty, of power and powerlessness, of economic capabilities and economic ruin, these are all implicated in ecological decline. And how are we in this part of the world not going to just care about it or pray about it, but what are we going to be able to, how are we going to act on this? I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying it should be part of our pictures. The call for global solidarity, the call for the common good, common ground. These are really important moves taking place in churches, basically around the world, and some in Canada. Rituals, liturgies, symbols, and prayers are all being transformed. For many people, we can, you add we're going to pray for the earth as a little extra onto our list of prayers. But I think some are more profound than that, of saying we really need to, we have to have an awakening to how the divine is present in the natural world, and how does that speak to us and teach us, and how are we going to recognize that the natural world in all its elements are also modes of divine presence. How are we going to not just pray for the earth, but integrate ecological wisdom in a more deep way, in a more authentic way? That, we are earthlings, I would say, even as a theologian, we are earthlings first and Christians second. And to me, that's extremely important. I recognize that's controversial in some circles, but I still think it's true. So over the past 50 years, I would say eco-theology is now established. It's more or less working in most churches. It's present, not everywhere, but it's quite common. You'd be very hard pressed to find a church that doesn't have some awareness of ecological issues. I think theological training is probably lacking behind some of the churches. I think eco-theology is, so I work with eco-theologians, and they are absolutely dedicated, passionate, and this is basically what they do, but they're very much a minority of theologians. So I don't think eco-theology is taught in universities, in theological, not with any depth. It's taught. It's just what I'm after is it more than just on the surface? Is it deeply integrated? And I was mentioning some of the reasons why that is difficult, and those reasons still exist, that it can be difficult. And I will pause here, but I do have a third section on being a green church. But we could take another pause here if you have comments or questions or additions, things that I've missed. Many of you work in this area, so you also have lots of wisdom and insights.
There's no questions. I suggest that you can follow with your third part, and then we will take some questions at the end.
Okay, Martin, thank you. So I'm just going to begin. This is a shorter section, but what does it mean to be a green church? And I have just a few questions to begin with. What does it mean, a green church? What do you think it means? What do I think it means? How far are we willing to go to address ecological issues in the context of our churches? How far are we willing to revise our understandings of Christianity in light of ecological stress and ecological wisdom? How far are we willing to go? I say that because I was giving I worked with some religious sisters, many over the years, And I remember doing this whole expose on cosmology and evolution and eco-theology. And this religious sister said, pounding her hand, she said, all I want to know is, am I going to go to heaven with Jesus or not? So I think sometimes that we collapse it all and say it's too big, it's too much, but I think it's still a question. How far are we willing to revise our understanding, shift our awareness? How far are we willing to let go of some of our comfortable spiritual places so that we can open ourselves up to a more radical and deep understanding? Is the natural world just a place of resources? And so then the challenge is, do we just need to share them more justly? Or is the natural world also a place of ecological spirituality? Meaning, do we learn about the divine from the natural world? Or is the natural world actually giving us modes of divine presence? Which means extinction is extinction of modes of divine presence. And that is an ecological sin. That is an ecological violation. I'm going to read a quote from a theologian from Australia who was the impetus for the Earth Bible. I just happen to like this quote a lot. He says, quote, "To violate the earth is to tear God's masks, to scar God's face, and to desecrate God's dwelling." Now that's quite profound. That means the earth is not just a set of resources. It means what we do to the natural world, we do not just to ourselves and not just to the earth community, but also to God. Now, what does that mean? What kind of spirituality is that? And this joins with something that Geswanuth Slahut, who we call Chief Dan George, who says, "We are as much alive as we keep the earth alive." Now that's very significant as well. If the earth diminishes, do we diminish? Not just life becomes more stressful, but does something in our interiority, in our awareness, in our abilities, in our spiritual capacity, does that also diminish? Or is our ecological issues, should they be framed as justice issues? So eco-justice is a big player in the world today, and that's a very good thing, inside and outside of the church. It's extremely important. Eco-justice is the cry of Extinction Rebellion, of climate justice, of food justice. All these movements, they're so important. But they're really about, they're really about the equitable distribution of benefits and burdens. But it's not just an issue of justice. It's bigger, but it includes that. What we are doing to the earth, Patriarch Bartholomew reminds us what we're doing to the earth is ecological sin. So what does that mean? I want to say that for those of you who come from the Catholic tradition, Laudato Si has been a very important document and has had considerable influence, not just in the Catholic Church, and maybe even less in the Catholic Church than elsewhere. But it's a very profound calling of the multiple dimensions of ecological issues. Laudato Si was a very significant contribution, likely one of the more significant religious documents on ecological issues. So I think that's a very good contribution to the world. It was also the first social teaching that was to the world, not the church. It was open, it was accessible. It wasn't using biblical proof texting. It was saying, this is what is going on, and this is why it is a religious issue. I thought most of it was very, very well done. What about our religious experiences? What does that mean? Where do we encounter the divine? You know, oddly enough, in theology, and I have spent a lot of time studying theology, it's not a common topic to say, where do we encounter the divine? It's very interesting, but it's what a valid question that is. I know it's different for different people, but I think it's quite critical to ask ourselves in the era coming, and as green churches, where do we encounter the divine? What does that mean? It's also true that in the natural world, historically and across religious traditions, the natural world has been the central place of encountering the divine. It's, you know, Christianity, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have sacred religious texts. I mean, Hinduism does as well, but the natural world is less prominent in what we call the monotheistic traditions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. It's very prominent in most other religious traditions. So again, a question: to be a green church, what is the relationship between Christianity and the natural world in your church context? What does it mean to say the Cenozoic, the era of the past 65 million years, is in decline and is being replaced by the Anthropocene, which is an era of ecological decline, human caused? What does that mean? How are we going to face this? So here we are as COP26 starts. I did say I thought it was a pathetic result from G20. There are social movements, there are social activists, ecological activists, Greta Thunberg, bless her heart, and other prophets of our time. Will citizens, so activist citizens, be able to exert enough pressure? So I'm just going to check my notes here. I just have 2 more sentences. I really think it's important, you know, if we say we're followers of Jesus, what does that mean? And whatever it means we're a participant. It's not a place of escape. Religion should never, ever be a place of escape. And if we have escapist, otherworldly spiritualities, I think that is a spiritual frailty. So we have to be participants. So if we're going to be in green churches with communities and rituals, call for justice and spiritualities, all of these need to be active for us to have a road forward. And I think I have seen so many changes in the past 30 years. I think it's possible. Of course, much more needs to be done. Yeah, much more needs to be done. And I'll end there. So we have a few minutes for discussion.
We have a question here about the damages made by the missionary proselytism. And yeah, well, we know about maybe Catholicism, but also other perspectives. If you can elaborate about that, please.
I'm not a historian, but I know that some religions are more aggressive than others in their proselytizing, and Christianity has been particularly aggressive, and some would say successful, that has been the ability for Christianity to spread around the world is an indication of its success. Now, in a post-colonial world, it's much less clear that Christian proselytizing, it depends, you know. Sometimes when Christianity, in some countries where Christianity came to, it was a gentle entry point and it was blending with local indigenous wisdom. And other times it was much more aggressive and silencing ecological wisdom and social wisdom, and has been a very aggressive religion. And so I think it really depends. But I think proselytizing, you know, is Greta Thunberg proselytizing? I would say, yeah, she is. Now, she happens to be saying things I really like, but I still think she's a prophet. She's proselytizing. She's calling people to another vision. I think when we say we have the truth, the only truth, and the ultimate truth, that is something we should not do. And I don't think she does it. I'm just saying what we mean, whatever we mean by proselytizing has to be defined. Are there other questions, Martin? Other comments?
Sorry, someone want to know the quote. You have quoted someone, but I don't remember exactly when the person
is this the Norman
asked this
Hagel
question,
quote?
but you quote someone, and she would like the exact quote, if it's possible, if you have it written and
I do.
maybe put it in the chat.
So
Okay, if you can put it in the chat, it can be useful. Thank you.
You want me to write it in the chat?
Yeah, if it's possible, or at the end, yeah, we can have the other questions, and at the end, maybe you can paste it in the chat, so we will have it. Another question, maybe the last one. The pandemic has helped people turn to nature to discover the divine. They can go to church, so they go fishing or hiking. They are often surprised by their experience. In interrogative. So
that strikes me as a very valid comment. I mean, a lot of people had to stop traveling, myself included. I, however, do go out. I do go to all the nature trails near me, but now there's many other people there. And as much as that's a very good thing, you know, people have been discovering the natural world. I think the natural world is a place of revelation, is a place of inspiration, is a place of spirituality, and it's instructive, as long as it's not trivialized. So if you go for a walk in the woods as some respite and some place, you go, oh, how lovely, and then you go back to Netflix, I don't think you've learned a great deal. I think one has to pause and listen and be quiet, and you have to be in a receptive mode in the natural world. You have to be able to see yourself as part of a larger whole, not as some instrumental value for you just having a nice day. So, you know, people, just because people are spending time in the natural world does not mean they're radically open. It just means they're, you know, they're just going out for a nice sunset. But if you go for a nice sunset and you realize, oh my goodness, the sun. Rabbi Heschel used to say, there's a miracle that happens every day. The sun comes up. And so if you actually start thinking about the sun and the earth and the solar system, that's, you start opening your horizons. If you start to realize, what if this is God's world for the past 12.6 billion years? What does that mean? That means it's not about me. First of all, it's not even about us. It's a much bigger project. And that gives us humility. That, I think, opens the possibility of what Rudolf Otto called an encounter with the numinous. I think these are not trivial things. These are quite profound. But just spending time in nature, you can still instrumentalize it. You can still say, this is serving me. This is a nice resource. I'm saying we need to shift our worldview to something more profound.
Not a truly last question, but
truly
because
last
it's quick, so I think it can be useful to answer it. Do you have good examples of where or who has incorporated creation into liturgy? Or take liturgy out into creation?
So all the work on the project called Seasons of Creation, it's very good. There's so many resources for churches. So Seasons of Creation is one. The World Council of Churches has put out all kinds of documents. Seasons of Creation is an ecumenical initiative. There's rituals and liturgies. There's so many resources available. But someone has to actually bring them to your church context, bring them to your study groups. It's really countless. Seasons of Creation is one that comes to mind that's easily accessible. It's online, it's available. Joe, do you want to say something quick about Seasons of Creation? Because you know what probably, Joe Gunn, my pal. Well, can you say something about Seasons of Creation while I type this quote in the chat?
Well, only to say that this is the Catholics only picked it up in 2015 when Francis, after Laudato Si, when Francis encouraged us all to participate. It takes place every year from September 1st to October 4th, which is the feast day in our calendar of Francis of Assisi. And so there are not only, there is an international interfaith, well, Christian ecumenical group that has resources, as Heather has pointed out, but there also are Canadian groups such as For the Love of Creation that pushes this in Canada, Kairos, Citizens for Public Justice, in other words, to bring some even advocacy points into our work in the season of creation, which this year led right up into the election, didn't it? So you're right, they're all good resources out there.
So there's also a broader set of resources around seasons of creation that are Lent. So Lent and Advent, it goes through the whole year. It's all the Christian religious rituals have been revised with an ecological dimension. So there are lots of resources. I think, is that the quote that whoever wanted the quote, is that the one, or was it Chief Dan George? I'll just tell you the Chief Dan George one in case you care. We are as much alive as we keep the earth alive.
Thank you very much, Heather.
My pleasure.
It was very, very interesting. And so thank you. Very interesting, very enriching also. And thanks to all of you also to be there. And thank you to Renaud de Grégoire, who set up all this series of conferences online for the 15th anniversary of the Green Church. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Martin, merci beaucoup. Thank you all for coming. Nice to see some